I gave them my old truck so they could commute to work. 2 days later, I found it listed online. When I asked why, my daughter-in-law said, "We don't want junk from you." I wasn't angry until I saw they claimed I abandoned it. That same day, she received a notice in the mail that wiped the smile from her face when she read. I gave them my old truck so they could commute to work, and 2 days later, I found it listed for sale online, with the description saying abandoned vehicle, owner untraceable, must sell fast. I stared at my phone screen in the parking lot of the hardware store, where I'd stopped to pick up some oil filters, and my hands started shaking so bad I had to grip the steering wheel of my sedan just to steady myself. That faded red Dodge Dakota, with the dent in the driver's side door from when Daniel backed into a post when he was 17, the truck I'd spent 3 weekends rebuilding the transmission on just last month, the same truck I'd handed the keys to my son with a quiet nod because that's how I show I care, was being sold out from under me like I didn't even exist. My name is Harold Bishop, and I'm 67 years old, and I've spent my entire life fixing things, instead of saying what I feel because words always felt harder than wrenches, and now that habit had come back to bite me hard. I'm the kind of man who holds on to control even when I should let go, who measures every relationship through what I can fix or provide instead of just being present, and my stubborn pride has cost me more than I care to admit over the years. I pulled up to Daniel's house 20 minutes later, without calling first, because another one of my flaws is that I never think before I act when I'm angry, and I just barged right in through the front door that I'd helped install 5 years ago. "You listed it," my voice came out higher than I wanted it to, and I hated how it cracked with hurt instead of staying firm and steady. I held my phone out showing the online marketplace post, and Daniel was standing by the kitchen sink looking like he wanted to disappear into the floor. "That's my truck, Lion." She was leaning against the counter with her arms crossed over her chest, wearing that expression she always wore when she'd already made up her mind about something, and nothing I said was going to change it. Lion was my daughter-in-law, 34 years old with sharp features and sharper words, the kind of woman who saw sentiment as weakness and utility as the only value worth considering. "We don't want junk from you," she said without even a hint of apology in her tone. "It barely runs." I felt my face go hot and my jaw clenched so tight my teeth hurt, because I'd just spent 73 hours over 3 weekends making sure that truck ran perfectly, and she was calling it junk to my face. "That truck runs better than most vehicles half its age," I said, and I could hear the edge creeping into my voice. "I rebuilt the entire transmission myself." Daniel finally spoke up from where he was hovering near the doorway like a man already halfway to running away. "Dad, we appreciate it, we really do, but we need something more reliable for Lion's commute, and we figured we could sell it and put the money toward a down payment." I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw the exhaustion in his eyes and the way he couldn't quite meet my gaze, and I realized he wasn't the one driving this decision at all. "So you put it up for sale 2 days after I gave it to you," I said slowly, trying to keep my temper in check even though my pride was screaming at me to just walk out and never look back. "That's fine, that's your choice, but you listed it as abandoned with an untraceable owner." Lion's expression didn't change one bit. "It's ours now," she said like she was explaining something simple to a child. "We can do what we want with it. The description gets more attention, more buyers." I nodded slowly and I could feel something shifting inside my chest, something cold and calculated replacing the hot anger. "Right," I said quietly. "It's yours." I turned to leave but stopped at the door and looked back at them both. "Did you ever transfer the title?" Daniel's face went a little pale and Lion's confident expression flickered just slightly. "We were going to do that this week," Daniel said quickly. "We've just been busy with work and everything." I nodded again and walked out without another word, because I'd already learned everything I needed to know. That evening, I sat in my garage staring at the metal filing cabinet in the corner, where I kept every vehicle document I'd ever owned going back 40 years, because I'm meticulous about paperwork to the point of obsession, another flaw that my late wife used to tease me about, and I pulled out the file for the Dakota. The title was still in my name, and I'd never signed the transfer section, and Daniel had never filed anything with the DMV, because of course he hadn't. He'd always been terrible with administrative tasks, and Lion was too confident in her own cleverness to double-check the details. I made myself a cup of coffee that went cold while I sat there thinking and planning, and that's when the real problem with my personality showed itself, because once I get an idea in my head about how to fix something or prove a point, I can't let it go. I obsess over every detail until it consumes me completely. I wasn't just going to reclaim my truck. I was going to make them understand exactly what they'd done and feel the full weight of dismissing me like I was nothing. The next morning I drove to the municipal clerk's office and waited in line behind a young couple registering their new car, and when I got to the window I was greeted by Maribel Cruz, a woman in her early 50s who I'd known casually for years through various vehicle transactions. "Harold," she said with a smile that faded when she saw my expression. "What brings you in today?" I slid the paperwork across the counter. I need to file a report for fraudulent misrepresentation of vehicle ownership, I said calmly, and I need to place a lien for unpaid mechanical restoration services. Her eyebrows went up and she looked at the documents carefully. This is your truck, she asked. Yes, ma'am, I said. I loaned it to my son and his wife, and they've listed it for sale, claiming it's abandoned with an untraceable owner when the title is still in my name and was never legally transferred. Maribel's expression shifted to something between sympathy and judgment, like she could sense there was more to this story than just legal technicality. You're putting a lien on your own son, she asked quietly. I felt a flash of defensiveness surge through me. I'm protecting my property and my reputation, I said more sharply than I intended. They listed it fraudulently, and I have every right to file these claims. She processed the paperwork without further comment, but I caught her glancing at me a few times like she was trying to figure out if I was doing the right thing or making a terrible mistake. And honestly, I wasn't entirely sure myself anymore, but my pride wouldn't let me back down now. I'd calculated every fee I could possibly justify: the cost of the transmission rebuild, the new brake pads and rotors I'd installed, the oil changes and tune-ups over the past year, storage fees for keeping it at my property before giving it to them, and I'd even added interest calculated at the maximum legal rate allowed for mechanics liens in our state. It came out to just over $8,000, and when I saw that number written down, I felt a sick sort of satisfaction followed immediately by a gnawing guilt that I pushed down deep, because I was too far into this to stop now. The next step was filing with the online marketplace where they'd listed the truck, and I reported the post as fraudulent sale of stolen property, which I knew would freeze the listing immediately and potentially flag their account. I also reached out to the guy who'd been asking questions in the comments about the vehicle history, a man named Evan Torres who seemed genuinely interested in buying it. Hi Evan, I typed carefully. I'm the actual owner of this vehicle. The title was never legally transferred, and this is being sold without my authorization. I've filed the appropriate paperwork with local authorities. Just wanted to give you a heads up before you get involved in a complicated situation. He responded within an hour. Thanks for letting me know, man. That's really sketchy of them. I'll stay away from this one. I felt a grim satisfaction knowing that word would spread among the local buyer community, because these marketplace groups talk and Lion's credibility for any future sales was probably shot now. 3 days after I filed everything, Daniel called me and his voice sounded strained, like he hadn't been sleeping well. Dad, he said, and then paused for a long moment. Did you do something? Lion's freaking out. She got a letter from the county and something from the marketplace saying our account is under review. I kept my voice level and calm. I fixed what was broken, I said simply. The truck was listed fraudulently, and I took the appropriate legal steps to address it. I could hear Lion's voice in the background, sharp and angry, but I couldn't make out the words. Dad, this is crazy, Daniel said, and I could hear the pleading in his tone. We were just trying to get a better car. We didn't mean any harm. That's when my temper got the better of me, because it always does when I feel like people are dismissing the seriousness of what they've done. You didn't mean any harm. My voice rose despite my efforts to control it. You called my work junk, you listed it as abandoned like I didn't exist, and you were going to pocket money from selling something that legally still belongs to me. That's not harmless, Daniel. That's disrespectful and possibly criminal. The line went quiet for a moment, and then I heard him sigh. Can we talk about this in person? He asked. Tomorrow. I agreed and hung up, but spent the rest of the evening packing my garage and second-guessing everything I'd done, because that's another one of my flaws. I make impulsive decisions when I'm angry, and then torture myself with doubt afterward, but I'm too stubborn to actually reverse course. The confrontation happened on a Thursday afternoon, and I showed up at their house with all my documentation in a folder tucked under my arm, feeling like I was going into battle. Lion opened the door and her face was tight with anger, but there was something else there too, maybe fear or uncertainty, and she didn't say a word, just stepped aside to let me in. Daniel was sitting at the kitchen table with his head in his hands, and when he looked up at me, I saw my own eyes looking back at me, the same blue-grey color that ran in the Bishop family for generations, and I felt a pang of guilt that I immediately squashed down with justification. Let's get this over with, Lion said, standing with her back to the counter. I pulled out the first document and laid it on the table. This is the lien notice, I said. It details the mechanical work I performed on the vehicle over the past year, the parts I purchased, and the labor involved. The total comes to $8,347. Lion's hands actually trembled as she picked up the paper and read it. Daniel, it says we owe over $8,000. Her voice had lost all its sharp confidence, and now she just sounded shocked and maybe a little scared. Daniel looked at the paper and then at me. Dad, this can't be right. You gave us that truck as a gift. I shook my head. No, I said, and I kept my voice calm and measured even though my heart was pounding. I intended to gift it to you, but a gift requires respect. When you listed it for sale 2 days later, calling it junk and claiming it was abandoned with an untraceable owner, you demonstrated that you had no respect for me or my work. Therefore, I'm exercising my legal right to claim compensation for services rendered. Lion slammed the paper down on the table. You gave us that truck, she said loudly. You handed Daniel the keys and said, here you go, this is for you. That's a gift. You can't just take it back because your feelings got hurt. I felt my face flush with anger. This isn't about hurt feelings, I said, and my voice was rising now too. This is about you committing fraud by misrepresenting ownership of a vehicle that was never legally transferred to you. Daniel stood up suddenly, his chair scraping hard against the floor. Both of you stop. He looked at Lion and then at me. Dad, this is too much, way too much. We made a mistake with how we listed it, okay? We should have been more respectful. But this, he gestured at the lien notice. You're destroying our relationship over a truck. I felt something crack inside my chest because he was right and I knew it, but I'd gone too far down this road to turn back without losing face completely. I built my entire life on doing quality work and keeping my word, I said, and I could hear my voice getting rough with emotion. When you called that truck junk, when you listed it like I was nobody, you were saying that my work doesn't matter, that I don't matter. I won't accept that. Lion's expression shifted to something colder and she crossed her arms again. You set us up, she said quietly. You never transferred the title on purpose. You were waiting for us to do something you didn't like so you could pull this. That accusation hit me harder than I expected because there was a grain of truth in it that I didn't want to acknowledge. That's not true, I said, but even I could hear the uncertainty in my voice. I intended to transfer it once you'd shown you valued it. Instead, you proved you didn't within 48 hours. Daniel rubbed his face with both hands. This is insane. Dad, we're family. We're supposed to work these things out, not sue each other and file liens. I looked at my son and saw the exhaustion in every line of his face, and suddenly I felt very old and very tired. Then take down the listing, I said. Remove it completely, post a public correction explaining the error, and we can discuss settling the lien for actual costs instead of full valuation. Lion looked like she wanted to argue, but Daniel put a hand on her arm. We'll take it down, he said quietly. Today, right now. I nodded and started gathering my papers. The lien stands until I see the correction posted and the truck returned to my property, I said. After that, we can negotiate. I walked out of their house and sat in my car for 10 minutes before I could steady my hands enough to drive, because the confrontation had left me shaking with adrenaline and guilt, and a hollow feeling that wouldn't go away. Over the next week, I watched as they removed the listing, and Daniel brought the truck back to my garage without a word, just handed me the keys and walked away, and I wanted to say something to bridge the gap between us, but my pride kept my mouth shut. The truck sat in my garage, and I couldn't even look at it without feeling sick, because it represented everything I'd sacrificed for a petty victory. I reduced the lien amount to cover just the actual parts costs, about $2,300, and sent them a revised notice which they paid in 3 installments over the next 2 months, and every check that arrived in my mailbox felt like another nail in the coffin of my relationship with my son. Marable called me one afternoon about 6 weeks after everything went down. Harold, she said gently, I processed the final lien satisfaction for your truck situation. I just wanted to check on you. Are you doing okay? I appreciated her concern even though I didn't really want to talk about it. I'm fine, I said. Everything worked out legally. There was a pause. But did it work out? She asked. I didn't have an answer for that, so I thanked her and hung up. The months that followed were quiet in the worst possible way, and silence replaced the occasional family dinners we used to have, and Daniel's number would flash on my phone sometimes in the evenings. But I never answered because I didn't know what to say, and I was too proud to admit I'd let my need for control and validation destroy something more valuable than any truck. I sat alone in my garage most nights working on projects that didn't need working on, restoring things that weren't broken, because that's what I do when I don't want to face what I've actually broken. The truck ran perfectly now, better than it had in years, because I'd spent countless hours fine-tuning every system, but it just sat there unused like a monument to my stubbornness. I thought about Daniel constantly, about how he'd looked at me during that confrontation with disappointment and exhaustion, about how I'd chosen pride over my relationship with my only child, about how my need to prove a point had cost me something I could never rebuild no matter how skilled I was with my hands. Then one evening about 4 months after everything exploded, I got a letter in the mail, and it was from Lion, and my first instinct was to throw it away unopened, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside was a single handwritten page. Harold, it read, I'm writing this because Daniel won't and because I think you need to hear it. You were right about some things. We were disrespectful in how we handled the truck listing, and we should have talked to you first before making any decisions. We were wrong, and I'm sorry for that, but you need to understand what you did to us. That $8,000 lien notice came the same week we found out I was pregnant. We'd been trying for 3 years and had finally gotten good news, and instead of being able to celebrate, we were terrified about how we'd pay off a debt we didn't know we had while preparing for a baby. You weren't just teaching us a lesson about respect, you were punishing us financially at the worst possible time. Daniel hasn't told you about the baby because he's afraid you'll find some way to use it against us or turn it into another situation where you maintain control. I'm telling you because you're going to be a grandfather and you deserve to know, but also because you need to understand what your pride has cost you. You proved you were right about the truck title and the legal ownership. Congratulations, but you've lost your son in the process, and you're about to lose the chance to know your grandchild. The lien is paid, the truck is yours, you won, but what exactly did you win, lion? I read that letter 5 times sitting at my kitchen table, and by the third time tears were running down my face, because she was absolutely right about everything, and I'd been so focused on being legally correct and proving my point that I'd never stopped to consider the actual human cost of my actions. I was going to be a grandfather, and I'd found out from a daughter-in-law I'd treated like an enemy instead of from my son, and that realization hit me harder than anything else in this whole mess. I'd spent my whole life measuring love through labor, through fixing things and providing things, but I'd never learned how to just be present and vulnerable and admit when I was wrong. My need for control had always been about fear of being dismissed or forgotten or considered useless, and when Lion called my work junk, it had touched that deepest fear and I'd reacted by burning down everything around me to prove I still mattered. I picked up my phone and stared at Daniel's number for a long time before I finally pressed call, and it rang 4 times before he answered. Dad, his voice was cautious and guarded. Daniel, I said, and my voice cracked immediately. I got Lion's letter. I'm so sorry for everything. I was wrong. There was a long silence on the other end. Yeah, he said finally. You were. I let my pride destroy what matters most. I continued, and the words were coming hard, but I forced them out. I was so focused on being right about the truck that I didn't stop to think about what I was actually doing to you and Lion. I'm sorry, and I know that doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know I understand what I did wrong. I could hear Daniel breathing on the other end. Do you? He asked quietly. Do you really understand? Because this isn't just about the truck, Dad. This is a pattern. Every time something doesn't go the way you want, you find a way to maintain control. You can't just give something freely. You always have to have some angle, some way to take it back or hold it over people. It's exhausting. His words strung because they were true, and I'd never seen it clearly until this moment. You're right, I said. I've used fixing things as a way to control relationships because I never learned how to just trust that people value me for who I am instead of what I can provide. That's my flaw, and I'm working on recognizing it. I want to do better. I want to be in your life and in your child's life if you'll let me. Another long pause. Lion told you about the baby, Daniel said. She wasn't sure if she should, but I'm glad she did. We talked for an hour that night, really talked, and I admitted things I'd never said out loud before about my fears and insecurities, and my desperate need for control, and Daniel shared his own frustrations about feeling like he could never measure up to my expectations or earn my approval without strings attached. It was the most honest conversation we'd ever had, and it hurt in the way that real healing always hurts, like cleaning out a wound that's been infected for years. The aftermath of my revenge wasn't the satisfying victory I'd imagined when I was sitting in my garage, calculating lien amounts and filing paperwork. Lion and Daniel's financial situation had been significantly strained by the $2,300 they paid back to me, money that should have gone toward preparing for their baby, and they'd had to delay some purchases and cut back on their budget in ways that added stress to an already anxious time. The online marketplace had flagged their account, which meant they couldn't sell anything on that platform for 6 months, and word had spread in their local community about the disputed truck listing, which damaged Lion's reputation, even though the situation had been resolved. Their relationship with me had been damaged in ways that would take years to repair if it could be repaired at all, and there was a wariness now in how Daniel interacted with me, like he was always waiting for the other shoe to drop, always expecting me to find some new way to assert control or prove a point. The material consequences were significant, but the emotional ones were devastating. As for me, I'd won the battle over the truck and proven I was legally right, but I'd lost something far more valuable in the process. I sat alone in my garage night after night with a perfectly running truck I couldn't bring myself to drive because every time I looked at it, I saw the cost of my pride reflected back at me. I'd proven that I could outmaneuver them legally, that I knew paperwork and regulations better than they did, that I could make them pay for disrespecting me, but none of that filled the emptiness I felt when I realized I might miss my grandchild's birth or first steps or any of the important moments because I'd been too stubborn to let go of my need for control. The truck became a symbol not of my mechanical skill or my righteous anger, but of everything I'd sacrificed on the altar of being right. I started seeing a therapist at 67 years old, something I never thought I'd do, because I recognized that my patterns of behavior were destroying the relationships I valued most, and if I didn't change, I'd end up alone, with a garage full of perfectly maintained vehicles and nobody to share my life with. The real twist came about 6 months after that phone call with Daniel when he and Lion invited me over for dinner, and I walked in nervously expecting tension, and instead found them both smiling, and Lion was showing now, her belly round under soft sweater, and Daniel pulled me aside before we ate. "Dad," he said, "we've been talking a lot about everything that happened, and we want you to be involved in the baby's life. We want to move past this. But we need you to understand something." He looked me straight in the eyes. "You don't have to earn your place in our lives by fixing things or giving us stuff or maintaining some kind of control. We love you because you're my dad and our child's grandfather, not because of what you can provide. If you can accept that and just be present without the strings attached, then we can move forward." I nodded because I didn't trust my voice not to break. "I can do that," I managed to say. "I'm learning how to do that." Lion joined us and she put a hand on my arm. "Harold," she said, and her voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. "I was harsh too. I dismissed your work and I shouldn't have. That truck meant something to you and I treated it like garbage. I'm sorry for that. We both made mistakes." That moment of mutual acknowledgement felt more valuable than any victory I'd won through my calculated revenge. Later that night, as I drove home in my sedan, the Dakota still sitting unused in my garage, because I'd decided to actually gift it to a young mechanic at the local trade school who couldn't afford reliable transportation, I thought about how the whole situation had unfolded. I'd started with a legitimate grievance. My work had been dismissed, and my property had been misrepresented, but I'd let my pride and need for control turn a solvable problem into a devastating conflict that nearly destroyed my family. The revenge I'd executed so carefully, with all its legal precision and calculated consequences, had been technically successful but ultimately hollow, because it hadn't given me what I actually wanted, which was respect and connection and value in my son's life. I'd learned that being right isn't the same as being wise, and that winning an argument often means losing something more important. My flaws, the obsessive control and the inability to express love, except through labor, and the stubborn pride that wouldn't let me back down even when I knew I was wrong, had created this entire disaster, and it was only by recognizing and confronting those flaws that I'd been able to start rebuilding what I'd broken. The story doesn't have a neat, happy ending, because real life doesn't work that way. My relationship with Daniel and Lion is still healing, and there are moments of tension and awkwardness when my old patterns try to reassert themselves, and I have to consciously choose a different path. When my grandson was born 7 months after that dinner, I was there at the hospital, and I held him with tears streaming down my face, and I made a promise to myself, and to him, that I would be present in his life without conditions or control, that I would love him freely the way I should have loved his father all along. The truck situation taught me that revenge, even when legally justified, comes with costs that can't be calculated on a spreadsheet, and that sometimes the hardest thing to rebuild isn't a transmission or an engine, but the trust and connection between people who love each other, but don't know how to show it without causing damage. Across town, Lion still occasionally thinks about those months when they were dealing with the Leon and the stress and the financial burden, and she whispers to Daniel sometimes late at night, "He planned that from the start, didn't he? He never really intended to just give us that truck freely." And Daniel, who knows me better than anyone, always responds honestly, "I don't think he even knew what he intended. He wanted to help, but he couldn't do it without keeping control." That's just who he's always been. And maybe they're both right, because when I look back on it now with the clarity that only comes from distance and therapy and hard self-examination, I'm not entirely sure if I set them up intentionally or if I just reacted with my established patterns when they triggered my deepest insecurities. What I do know is that the cost of finding out was almost more than I could bear, and the real revenge in this story wasn't what I did to them, but what I did to myself by letting my flaws dictate my actions instead of my love.